Hey, thanks for joining us. We are excited to sit down and have a conversation with David Jansen. I'm joined by my wife, Tiffany Aiklin, and my name's Travis, and I help lead Radiant Church. What has us excited is that on Sunday, we started a Christmas series where we are looking at the first three books of the Bible and how they point to Jesus. Obviously, we believe that Jesus is the reason for the season, but I think we get a sense from the first three books, what is the reason for Jesus? Not that the second person of the Trinity needs a reason to exist, but I think we get and grasp in a meaningful way kind of what he came to do by taking a look at the first three books of the Bible. So David did a fantastic job of kind of giving us an overview of Genesis and helping us understand that we can, that the promise starts at the very beginning. And so our hope is that in looking at these first three books that we can celebrate Christmas in a real meaningful way. I thought it was you guys have any thought? How did you think it went, David?
I've been stressing about it all week, and then, but I think it went well. I feel really blessed by how people were saying that God used it. I was just floored by that. So that was cool.
What kind of feedback did you get?
I think it kind of split into two camps. One element of feedback I heard was just appreciating the vulnerability of sharing my life and stuff, that's totally God, because that was all added in on Friday. That was not part of what I reviewed before. And then the other element of feedback was just appreciating looking at the whole story of the Bible and how from Genesis to Jesus, what's God doing and what's he doing now?
Yeah. You broke Genesis into, was it 6 or 7 different acts?
I don't know, probably 7.
7? Can you, together, can we list them? The first act of Genesis is creation, and then fall. The fall in Genesis 3.
Yeah, the fall and the consequences of sin. So, that we're still feeling that today. So that's carried on. But
And then the third act was God's response, which was that question, where are you? And who told you you were naked? Again, sorry, if you've never read Genesis, we're ruining it, but you can read it for yourself. But a story is old. And then from there, what's the fourth act? Besides
part of God's response is not only his pursuit, but his promise right away that he would fix it, that he would provide a seed of the woman who would one day crush the head of the serpent and crush the curse of sin and death. And so the fourth act becomes the search for the seed. And that really can be carried on through the rest of Genesis and through the whole Old Testament. You can follow that story, which then moves.
Because so you're given this promise, like there's one coming and he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel, is the famous kind of cryptic promise. But you read the Old Testament wondering, with each kind of hero, with each character who arises, you think, is this the one? Is this the promised seed? Is God finally going to break in and deal with the situation?
Right, because you see God using in his language some of the Genesis 1 language and his blessings of different people throughout, specifically in Genesis, but throughout the Bible.
Right.
And there's this call back to that seed. And that metaphor of seed as offspring is all throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah. It was wonderful because you talked about how, this is obviously the story of the Bible, but you then shared this is the story of the stories that we love, like current kind of stories, or not current, but stuff that's written in the last century. Every story we love kind of has this theme or thread. So you talked about the Matrix and kind of the promised one who would come, and whatever. You talked about Lord of the Rings, you talked about Harry Potter, and you talked about Star Wars, like a new hope. This theme is the theme of every good story, and it finds its source in the scriptures. One question I had for you guys was more of if you were on a desert island and you had to take one of those stories with you, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or The Matrix. I don't even want to mention The Matrix in those in those three.
First movie was great. Then it kind of went off the rails. So
yeah, I guess. Yeah. What would you guys? I mean, what would you guys take?
I think it would be Lord of the Rings for me.
Yeah, I think there's literally no question. Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite books in all our series. Like, we just finished with my kids again, and I love it. Now, I really strongly dislike the movies, but that might, of course, of course.
I was gonna say Lord of the Rings, but I feel scared to say it because what you guys are gonna find out is that I've never read it, and I know what dorks like you two do. You say, you've never even heard the story if you've not read it.
If I can just make one pitch for reading the books, and because the movies, what they do well is they're beautiful. Like the casting and the scenery is gorgeous. But I feel like you get this plot with so much of what is rich about it stripped out because Tolkien, is richly theological in the way but it's so suffused with goodness. Like you learn to love what is good, and you just like those books do a magnificent job of making you love what is good and hate or what is evil.
Yeah,
and it's just I love those books.
Well, I love the movies, and I'm going to take a TV to my island.
If I had to choose based on the movies, DVDs. I'd be choosing Harry Potter, I think.
Well, I think that since I haven't read the books, I might have to go with Star Wars. I might be relegated to... If we're talking about films, then I'm going with Star Wars.
We'll bless you. We'll bless you in your choice.
If I get to take a DVD player to my island... I'm taking Star Wars. One thing that Tiff, do you have anything to say? Like, what did you love about the sermon or this series that we've got going and using the first 3 books to, I guess, tell the story?
Yeah, I just loved being swept back up into the big story. I think it's easy at Christmas to kind of narrow in on some of the scenes.
Yeah, like
of the story. Yeah. So I think taking it back to, this is that seed that will crush the serpent's head. And then even how you brought up Jesus saying, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies.
Yeah.
And so I think sitting there picturing the drama unfolding of even the characters involved in that scene of shepherds and Mary and Joseph, knowing this is that seed, and then walking with Jesus and hearing him say, lest a seed fall into the ground and die.
Yeah.
And that the picture of like, we're between the first advent and the second advent. And just the language of the seed, that word picture.
Yeah.
Knowing it's fallen into the ground and died, and something else has taken root and is growing up and taking shape. And that's the story we're part of. It's amazing.
There was a really strong point in the sermon where you said, what happens to seeds that are buried? They begin to grow. And it was a reference to Jesus's death and resurrection, that he was buried, he was put under. And what happens to seeds that are put under, life begins to sprout. And so there was this kind of idea of resurrection life breaking through the seed.
Yeah. The point of the story being so important, big story being so important. Why is it so important that we're constantly living into this big story? Because it's how we orient ourselves. It's how we see ourselves rightly. It's how we interpret rightly what's happening in our day. Why do you think big story is so important, David?
Yeah, because I think shows us where we're heading. What is God doing? And it gives us hope, as I tried to show in my sermon, because right now it feels like we live in a cursed world, and we live in a broken world, and it can be like, what is God doing? Like, we claim that Jesus rose from the dead and that he has victory, but where is this? Like, what is going on?
Yes.
And seeing the big picture story, seeing, again, one of my favorite things about the Bible is that literally God's goal in Genesis 1, it is completed in Revelation 22, the last chapter of the Bible. Like he never swerves from his main purpose, and he is doing it. And we've seen how he's risen and fallen, or how he's moved and promised and fulfilled that before, and he's promised more things, and we
are waiting in that.
So
Yeah.
I love that we are where we are.
It's beautiful.
You made a comment. There's probably a lot of people have read the first 3 chapters of Genesis, the creation account, but there's actually, is it 50 chapters in Genesis?
Yeah, that's right.
It's a long book. And you made some comments about, I love the book of Genesis, and I had to edit out so much. Like, what would you have said if you had more time to say it?
Yeah, there was a bunch, but 3 things that I specifically were in the sermon at some point and had to get axed.
So sad.
Yeah, one is in Genesis 5, we've got Adam and Eve, the fall, Cain and Abel, and then we get this genealogy of, and a lot of times people, myself included, read that and like, these are people that lived 800, 900 years. What is that? And it can be disorienting. And we need to realize that we're looking at it through 21st century lenses. The Bible is written for us, but it wasn't written to us. And these types of long lives and genealogies wouldn't have been unusual for them. But one thing that, when you read Hebrew literature, repetition is a key way that those authors are showing you their theme. And what you notice when you start looking at that, in that genealogy, it says, yes, Seth lived 912 years and he died. Methuselah lived 969 years, whatever, and he died. And that drumbeat of, and he died, and he died. And it's like, that is what the author is drawing your attention to. Like, death is reigning on this earth. And so, oh man, like the author's showing you, the fall is spreading. Yeah. Death is here. The second thing is, man, Genesis 3, the fall. And I kind of alluded to it, that everybody's, all these people that rise up in Genesis, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all face that crossroads. Yeah. The same, and the authors of Genesis.
What's the crossroads? Like the crossroads of to eat fruit or to listen to a talking snake?
Right.
Like, what's the fork in the road you're referring to?
Yeah, that where Adam and Eve were standing before a tree and a snake, and so really what they were choosing between was God's way or my way.
That's right.
God, do what God says and trust his wisdom, or make my own decision based on what looks like a good idea to me.
Yeah, right.
And what you see is the Genesis authors using this imagery all throughout this. So the key line in Genesis 3 is Eve saw the fruit, she took it, she ate it, she gave it to her husband. And you see that over and over again. When Noah, when he has his fall, it's because he's a tree, a vine. He goes to his vine, which is in Hebrew the same word as tree. He eats fruit and he gets drunk, and it's like, oh, his fall is the same. It's tying back to the same thing. Abraham and Sarah, they are promised by God that they're going to have a son, but God's doesn't seem to be answering it. And so what do?
Right.
It says Sarah sees her servant Hagar. She took her servant and gave her to Abraham. It's like that. Oh my gosh, they're using those words. And it's like, this is this. Right. They're at the crossroads here. And what's really fascinating, and just to like, is they go down to Egypt, Abraham and Sarah do, and the story gets kind of inverted. Pharaoh sees Sarah and takes her. And so suddenly Pharaoh is like Eve and Adam, and then Sarah is the fruit. But then who does that make Abraham to be? He's kind of like the snake. And it's like, oh my gosh, the line of the seed is the line of the snake, or is he acting like a snake? And we get to Jacob, and Jacob doesn't just act like a snake. He is a snake. He comes out grabbing his brother's heel. And so what is God going to do if his seed line is like blended with a snake? And like, how does he solve this? So that's just fascinating. I love the artistry there. And finally, the last thing is we do see Genesis as a whole has a story, and it climaxes with the story of Joseph. And in chapter 41 of the book, we see for a glimpse of Joseph fulfilling the Genesis 1 vision. He is made into an image of Pharaoh, and he's given rule and dominion over Egypt. And Egypt flourishes in the midst of a famine. So it's like another Eden in the middle of a desert. And it's like, oh, God's accomplishing it. Like, he's doing what he meant. But then he died. Joseph, at the end of Genesis, dies. And it's like, oh, he wasn't the seed. What is actually the answer?
Right. Huh. Do you have any, probably most of us have read those stories or read the book of Genesis. And I'm not sure that we got all of that from it. Do you have any, well, I guess the first question I would want to ask is like, why do you think spending time in the Old Testament is valuable? And then I think probably the second question would be, do you have any tips for us to see those things that you are seeing? Because that, you seem excited. That sounds exciting. But I think probably most of us would plow through those stories in a Bible reading plan and probably not get and grasp, especially some of the literary kind of elements. It's interesting. I'm in seminary right now, and I feel like the thing that's being highlighted most is I've done theology, and I've done kind of the historical context, understanding kind of who this was written to and what was going on. The thing that I've missed most of my Christian life is probably, and is key to understanding the meaning, is the literary context. Like, because structure, when you see it, is key to meaning, and you can see structure in what's being written. But I would say that the literary component is the hardest one to pick up on and involves a fair amount of speculation. That's what I've noticed. Absolutely. It's like, what was the author? I remember thinking that in English class as we sat around and speculated about what the author was trying to convey through their story. I was just thinking to myself, well, how do we know? How do we know what Matthew was trying to say with his gospel account? We don't get to sit down with Matthew and interview him. So whereas the theological implications, the historical context, we can know that with greater certainty. Kind of the literary kind of structure, or what they were trying to do with the way they were writing the book, that feels like we're speculating.
Yeah, and I mean, I was an English teacher, and I would tell my students that very question, like, well, how do we know the author meant this and things like that? And what I can say is, we don't necessarily know when you're speculating that exact idea was in his or her mind.
Yes.
But like, the beauty of art and stuff like that is not that you can make up anything, not at all.
Right.
But that when you're doing this thing, first of all, the author is far more immersed in it and thinking through it than you would probably realize. A lot of things you see, they probably did mean.
Yes.
But also, when they're in the flow, like, you're joining in there, and it's like, it's a great conversation in many ways across centuries and time. And as long as you're drawing and rooting your speculation, as we call it, in the text and tying it to, like, oh, I see, then you're on the right track. There's even if they didn't explicitly mean it, they would probably hear that and be like, yes. And I think with the Old Testament as helping to get into the literary thing is just realizing that we read the Old Testament, it seems kind of weird. There's like, the stories don't seem like reading a novel now.
Right.
And we have to, first of all, realize this is another culture. This is their literature, and we have to humble ourselves and experience it for what it was. But then when we do, realizing that, no, they were artists.
Yeah.
They took their writing of this scripture every bit, if not more seriously than we take art and writing now. And so when you see details, when you see particularly repeated things, those are absolutely intentional. And when you see New Testament authors referring to words and referring to like phrases and stuff like that, absolutely, that's intentional. And so this has been new to me. It's beautiful and rich, and I love it. I would highly recommend spending some time with the Bible Project. Their videos, their podcasts. That is where that has what has opened my eyes to this. And once you see it, you can't not see it, and it's wonderful. I mean, I will fully say, I don't see many things on my own. A lot of the things that I see, in fact, all the things I shared earlier, were not my own observations. Those are things I received from the Bible Project.
Yeah.
But what is so fun is when you do start to see the connections for yourself.
Yes.
If I can share one connection I made that a while ago that I was like, oh my gosh, I actually made this connection. It's amazing. Was one thing that has always baffled me and has always been confusing is when Jesus, he's talking and he says, Peter is like, how many times do I need to forgive someone? 7 times? And Jesus says, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Yeah. And it's like, did he say 77? 70 times? What is this? And it's like, okay, that's kind of confusing. Then I was reading Genesis 4. After Cain falls, he goes and gives Cain's lineage. Yeah. And we see his son, I think Lamech.
Yeah, that's right.
Boasting and saying, I killed a man for wounding me. Lamech's vengeance is not 7 times, but 70 times 7. I was suddenly like, that's what Jesus said. And then realizing, suddenly Jesus, I think, is very clearly tying back to it, because Lamech is talking about vengeance. Yes. My vengeance will be 70 times 7. Yeah. And Jesus is saying, no, forgiveness should be 70 times 7. And I was like,
come on.
That is good. So
that's not only was I
like, God, you're amazing. And like, what does that look like for my own life? But then I was also a little bit pleased, like, oh my gosh, I made that connection.
Yeah, that's so exciting.
It's fun.
What about, Tiff, you can jump in here too, but like, do you have any tips for us for reading the Old Testament? I get it. You just gave us one in understanding this is their culture. It's not going to do or read in the way we would necessarily write it. So kind of to accept it on its own terms. But any other tips for making our way through the Old Testament in a way that's really valuable?
Well, I want to put an exclamation point on what you said about Bible Project. I've started their school. I'm in the middle of the class on reading the Hebrew Bible right now. And it's been fascinating and wonderful.
Another thing I would just say is the Old Testament, looking at the Bible not as a single book, although big picture is a single story, but as a library of books, and different books have different genres. Knowing what genre you're in and what to expect from that is huge, and particularly not entering it with our ideas necessarily of is it a history text or a science text or something like that. But so knowing where you're at in the Bible, both what type of genre is and where are you in the big story. So spending some time learning the big story of the Bible. And so where does this book take place in the larger story? Is great. And then finally, the last thing is, and I got this from the Bible Project as well, is realizing that what is the Bible? It's meditation literature. Yeah. That why is 1/3 of the Bible poetry? 1/3 of the Bible is narrative. 1/3, if God is just trying to tell us what to do, why
speak to us in a riddle?
Exactly. But as I kind of brought out in my sermon, I do think that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was a wisdom tree. God's mission, his goal is to give us his wisdom so that we can fulfill what he made us for and rule. And so wisdom comes through meditation, through listening to him. And so read through the Bible slowly. Read through it many times. Read through it in big chunks. Read through it in little chunks. Just And don't feel like, okay, it's not something to check off. It's something to dwell in. When you encounter something weird or odd, sit with it. Don't worry about trying to get it all at once. Like, oh, I'm going to master the Bible and check that off. You are not. I am not. No one is. This is something to spend your life on and meditate on, chew on it. And as you struggle with it, God is working through his word. He's promised that his word doesn't go out without coming through, and he will build his wisdom in you.
You made me think of Psalm 1 where it says, like, blessed are those who delight in the law of the Lord, who meditate on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. I think just recognizing, even if you don't understand it, even if, the first time I read through the Old Testament, I had to put a lot of question marks in the margins of places where I didn't understand it. I wanted to come back and understand, but there's just a blessing in being in it and meditating on it, and it causes you to flourish in your spirit.
I remember listening to someone say, I mean, it's common knowledge, but Israel, like the people of God, like Israel means to wrestle. And the people of God have learned to wrestle well with God, grapple with him. And definitely feel like that's the invitation as we read scripture, especially the Old Testament, is like, you are going to wrestle, and it's going to feel like that. And the people of God should learn to wrestle well, and really engage it. And I don't know that it's gonna come easy or quick, and I think as a result of that, we can disengage at times. So I appreciate the invitation to grapple with Genesis and all that it has for us. It was really, really fantastic preach on Sunday. So if you haven't listened to it, listen to it, and I think you'll enjoy it. So thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
We should get paid from the Bible Project. Should have to pay us for this. That was a shameless promo for the Bible Project. So I'm going to ask
Was
them.
it long enough?
Yeah, it's always long enough. It's never too short.
Okay.